Last year, my synagogue published our own Haggadah. We spent months studying it and writing commentary. And finally, we completed our work late in 2019, and it was published in February of 2020. Before the pandemic, before racial justice protests, before all sorts of things that have rightfully taken our attention. We have some sections to update. Still, there was one topic that was on our minds then and is still on our minds today. That issue is the rising anti-Semitism we have experienced in our country and our world. Anti-Semitism has increased not only in frequency and tenor, but also in how it has divided our already politically polarized communities. It has been a challenge to constantly remind people that anti-Semitism must be called out and condemned, especially when it comes from your own ideological side. Additionally, like so many things, it is harder to talk about it when we're not able to do so in person, face to face. Fortunately, the Haggadah presents us with an opportunity to address and to put into perspective the anti-Semitism and hatred that plague our world today. In Magid, we pick up our cup of wine and sing V'hi Sha'amda, saying, Shebechol dor vador omdim aleinu l'chalotenu. In every generation, enemies have tried to destroy us, but the Kadosh Baruch Hu has saved us from their hands. I remember as a child reciting these lines at the Seder with my bubby, a Holocaust survivor, sitting at the table. Her very presence bearing witness to these words. As we sang V'hi Sha'amda, I remember promising my young self to do my part in fulfilling the words, never again. This is part of what led me on my journey that allowed me to become a rabbi. Little did I realize as a child that it is a similar promise we affirm in this section of the Haggadah. The opening word, V'hi, is ambiguous. It is often translated as, and it is this that stood by our ancestors and us. But what is this? Some translate V'hi literally as, and she being a reference to the Shekhinah, to God's feminine presence. This is the aspect of God that stood with us throughout all the years of persecution, a strong and comforting presence who was with our ancestors during difficult times, who is still with us in difficult moments today. Most commentaries, however, understand V'hi by the context in which it's found in the Haggadah. Right before these words, we say, Baruch Shomer Havtachato LiYisrael. Blessed is God who keeps God's promise to Israel. Havtacha, promise, is also a feminine form. So V'hi could mean, and it is this promise that stood by our ancestors and us. The Haggadah goes on to reference Genesis 15:13 through 14, which is from the section known as the Brit Ben Habetarim. Here God tells Abraham, who is still Avram, that his ancestors will be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. Still, God will remember the promise to make Abraham a great nation, and God will ultimately free his people. Though the Torah here isn't specific, most commentaries understand God to be referring to freeing the Israelites from Egypt. It is a fulfillment of this promise that we celebrate on Seder night. The message of V'hi Sha'amda then seems clear. Just as God fulfilled God's promise to free people from Egypt, so too God has continued to fulfill the promise throughout the generations and will continue to do so in our day. Yet we know that things rarely work out so simply. The Israelites were redeemed from Egypt, but only after generations of slavery and persecution. My bubby survived the Holocaust, but her parents, her siblings, and so many others did not. What then do we make of this promise? Was it really fulfilled? Rabbi Meir Leibush, better known as Malbim, in his Haggadah commentary seems troubled by this too. Malbim agrees that V'hi is referring to a promise, but he believes that it was not the promise that God made to Abraham in Bereshit. Rather, the promise that the Haggadah is referring to is from Vayikra, Leviticus. In Parshat Bechukotai, Leviticus 26:44, God assures Moses that the Brit, the covenant between God and the Jewish people, will always endure. What is significant is that this verse from Vayikra does not focus on God's promise to a specific person or on a specific persecution. Rather, it is more general. It refers to any foreign land, and more significantly, to God's covenant with us. Our brit with God is an eternal covenant. It started with Abraham and continues through the Tanakh with each subsequent leader, committing to this partnership with God. It is an agreement that is based on the promises of both sides, even when its fulfillment takes time, energy, and sacrifice. With this interpretation, Malbim opens up the meaning of the promise of V'hi She'amda. What has sustained us through it all is not only God's promise to us, but also our promises to God. We all make promises, spoken and unspoken, about our connection to Judaism and the Jewish people. Some of these promises we have kept, and others we have broken. Here, the Haggadah gives us the opportunity to consider our Jewish promises, the promises we make to our parents and grandparents, to our children and grandchildren, and to ourselves, the promises that we make to God to set an example by living our values. At this part of the Seder, we are reminded that our people have survived centuries of persecution because they kept their Jewish promises, and that keeping these promises and helping others to do the same is the best way to fight anti-Semitism. V'hi She'amda is an opportunity to renew our Jewish promises and thereby work to fulfill the promise of our people. Chag Pesach Sameach.